how can assemblies and participatory democracy exercises be really valuable actually in seizing cultural moments rather than starting with the question, we've got an assembly and how do we create a cultural moment off the back of it. I've been thinking and researching a lot, like examples from around the world of when genuine democratic change actually happens, because I think we're in the game now where there's no point talking about small stuff. It's like, when does really big shift happen?
It's all well and good grabbing a moment, but really what is important is the effect that moment has. For those to be unignorable, I think the whole process has to be unignorable from the beginning all the way through to the end and onwards. One essential ingredient that's been missing, and that includes from the People's Plan for Nature and loads of other things, is comms, and more comms. And it's absolutely essential for, if you want a citizen assembly or any assembly to be seen as legitimate, people need to understand what it is and they need to know that one's taking place. I heard somebody talking about a film, and I've always wanted to sort of get the storyline of a citizens assembly to be in a soap, but I haven't managed to sort of get anybody to take that up.
You know, how do you make it unignorable? I would say, well, big change tends to happen when lots and lots and lots of very small things not only happen that are underpinned by the same principles, but are collectively visible, where the sort of bottom-up sense of actually this doesn't feel right anymore. It's the bottom-up thing that pushes the Overton window to say, oh yeah, we can't not do this because more and more people want to do it.
Legitimacy does rely on having stakeholders included. Inclusion is the way to get a thing not ignored. If it includes all the main stakeholders or a segment of the population, say, for example, Pontypridd, which has just suffered considerable flooding, were to establish its own People's Assembly to discuss how to deal with the flooding. And if that included all the people of Pontypridd, that would be very difficult for politicians to ignore. It would have legitimacy. At the national scale, that would mean many millions of people would need to participate in it. We've just had a petition calling for a new general election, which was supported, I think, by something like 3 million people, some extraordinary number, and has been ignored by the government because it's not regarded as legitimate. So the challenge for us is going to be overcoming that contest of legitimacy with existing institutions, that they will say, we are elected, we are more legitimate than you. Why should you independently set up assembly have the say? We are the existing government. We have been elected. Two suggestions follow from that. One is do it locally where you can get considerable inclusion about something that really matters to the population, say a flood or the future of the local school. It's got to be something that really matters. It's not, why we hate politics or what should we do about the bike paths. It's got to be something that really matters to people. Otherwise, people won't show up. And if that includes all the relevant people, all the locals with a stake, then it will have legitimacy.
About 10 years ago, I was part of a citizens jury that was based in a housing estate, a huge housing estate in Blackburn. One of the issues that we talked about quite a lot with the group was access to food and access to fresh food and healthy food and food poverty. At the end of the process, Craig came up to me and he goes, he leans forward like this and he goes, Pete, loved the process, great. And I'd worked with Craig obviously for 30 hours and I could see a huge but coming. And he goes, but I'm not going to wait for the fucking council. They're not going to do anything, are they? They'll never do anything. What are they going to do? Do you know what we're going to do? We're going to set up a food co-op on this housing estate. I was like, brilliant, Craig, go for it, go for it. And behind me, listening to this conversation, was the local Healthy Living Centre. And they heard that and they jumped on it and we both supported Craig and a few of the other participants in the jury. 2 years later, they established a food co-op on that housing estate with 450 families were members, which arguably may have transformed the diet of people on that housing estate. During the sortition process, one of the questions we asked folk was, are you engaged in any voluntary work at present? And if they said yes, we excluded them. So the people that took part in it were not people that were already taking action within the housing estate. So I guess why I wanted to bring this example was because I'm really interested in how, at a local level, for sure, anyway, we can make these processes less ignorable by using the enthusiasm and the passion of citizens themselves. I'm really interested in how we can put in place, like Lachlan describes, some kind of framework of support that recognises that we will always have out of these processes highly motivated and highly knowledgeable citizens that don't want to go away.
I love what you said, Pete, about excluding people that already do shit. So you get actually fresh people in your assembly by sortition who aren't already busy doing stuff in terms of volunteering or something. If you want self-organised outcomes, that's quite smart. And I suppose the thing about people being ready is like when we talk about systems as if they're not made of people, which they all are, then is that quite problematic? When we think we only look at a systemic solution. And actually, every single person in those systems that we're struggling to get to do the thing we want them to do is actually just full of like a shitload of people. So rather than thinking that it's a systemic problem in terms of our system we want to design or the solution we come up with, is it actually a problem with all the fucking people in the world? And is it a problem with all of us as well as them? I don't know. That feels like it's quite an opening up of something.
Lots of the really great stories we've heard so far have been around everyday democracy that's distributed. And I think it's really interesting that we're not elevating those enough because they go against that slightly hero narrative that we all want to feel, that we're all coming in and we're saving things by creating a big institutional change from the centre. And actually this slow burn, bringing people in, building deliberative democracy from the ground up may well be a way forward. It doesn't feel as good as when you say, oh, well, we did this in Ireland or this happened and here's the big change and it was in all the papers. Having said that, I think there is now a window for making that movement to push the government from the outside, because this government is now stuck in self-doubt and confusion and won't make the big changes it needs to make. So I think it's time for an external movement with all of us and others to make a quite precise push on what needs to change.
This is almost like a traditional model of thinking about how to influence policy. Think about the timing. If you know there's going to be a big policy decision in 6 to 9 months' time, this feels like a great time. If a big policy decision's just been made, it feels like a bad time. Actually, the nature of the pandemic meant that minds were being changed all the time and actually people were a bit less worried about that. So I just thought I'd set that out as a sort of framing, which I think is maybe helpful. Maybe thinking about like when that policy is fertile or labile, highly labile, ready to be changed. But I also accept there's potentially an argument. I think this is where a lot of you are in that space, which is almost like, fuck that. Don't worry if the policy is not ready, or don't always be waiting for government to be setting out when the agenda is on, or et cetera, et cetera. We actually need to create that movement to create the conditions where it is there. Where I've come to think about this is there's almost like 2 tracks. And one of those tracks is it's the sort of French model, but done properly, right? I.e. the government sort of sets it up and says, we are ready and we're going to act upon the recommendations, but it's actually done with the ability to deliver on what is sort of promised. And then the other track is actually just doing it completely separately from government. We're not even going to try and get endorsement or agreement that is going to feed into whatever. We're just going to do it and make a big song and dance about it until government then maybe feels that it needs to change.
If it's about timing and potential, and you see a moment and you move on it and you go, fuck, that thing's happening, let's do something. And then you have a really long process that takes months to organise. That's not how politics works. And I always find it interesting how much I think politics is quite like fashion, which is my background. And so it's a timing thing. Like there is a time when you wear that shade of coral and there is a time when you do not wear that shade of coral. And everyone kind of knows it in their bones. So I do think there is something about this like timing thing. You sort of remove the intuitiveness when you run a process that takes 16 months, right?
I'm going to start with a story about an old rundown swimming baths. So it's not directly connected to assembly. I suppose it's just that thinking about coalitions. Council were going to shut it. Local community basically petitioned, campaigned, did everything they could to stop that happening. They brought on board a bunch of local and national organisations who got interested. And then the council ended up being a very engaged partner. And at this point, we're nearly at the 30 million that we need to refurbish the entire building and repurpose it and turn it into an amazing space that does all sorts of swimming and cultural activities and becomes a town hall for the local area. So I suppose what I'm interested in is that idea of coalitions of the willing, the not yet willing. And I think that's a really helpful way of us thinking about this. I want to think about like ignorable by whom? Who do we want not to ignore this? Because there are different ways of looking at that. There's national government. And then there's also Pete's example of the people who are part of that process for whom it changes everything. There's a lot of focus on the process. And the things that I have learned in my recent experience with all of this is the wraparound stuff is just so important. The prep, the before bit, where you are working to engage people in why it matters, it being more than one-off, what they're going to do with the recommendations, the wraparound around the comms bit, the support for what happens after. All of these things are as important as the process itself, and I don't think they're always thought through with the same depth as the actual process itself. And then I think for me, the other thing is understanding impacts, and those impacts are big and small impacts. And there isn't really anywhere for us to do that, because actually the small impacts, they're not small, they're really big, and they're really, so to Pete's example, are really important.
There's a lot of stuff that comes up in these sessions where I often think like this is so like echoes things that we think about in terms of movement building and activism and organizing and stuff. So the idea of the imagined deemed possible, we've done a huge amount of work in trying to sort of make things seem possible that are obviously ridiculous, but perhaps like the only thing that you could possibly do that would be reasonable in another way. And on climate, that's really true. And we really went into that sort of be realistic, demand the impossible kind of frame for some time. And I feel like, a lot of that get lost in a rationalist, materialist sort of bun fight of boringness, basically.
I think one of the themes I'm hearing is, I know it's a very old one, but it's the principle of subsidiarity. At what level of complexity are you trying to make decisions? So one of the things that John was talking about it is a way of thinking about one very big thing and lots of propagation. So when one thinks about scale and propagation, we very often think of one big thing that needs to be very, very scaled, and lots of small things that can create a context in which things are shifting. Being clear about, if you like, what level of complexity are we seeking to work in any given context around the purpose of that decision making, the purpose of that gathering together. And then one last quick thought about storytelling, which is the hero's journey, which it always strikes me that somebody being invited into a citizen's assembly leaves their ordinary world, enters the process full of its trials and its tribulations and its hugs and its tears and its walkouts and its excitements and its mentors and its shapeshifters and things. And then hopefully you go and you grasp the elixir and you bring something really meaningful back into the world. So in storytelling, that process has got a very, very fabulous traditional storytelling lens.
I'm really interested in how we create the space for politics to move into, and I think that resolves a lot of the idea that there's a tension between Overton window and legitimacy because you're out ahead of the game. The key question then becomes, how do you create a space that's sufficiently radical in the definition of the space? I'm really interested in the idea of a crowdsourcing a people's charter and what Ollie Whittington and the gang are doing with the Our House campaign. And I think that can be built from the local. Anyone who knows my work knows it begins with like telling the stories of what people are already doing, not beginning from the local in a kind of negative way, but beginning with the best at what's going on.